On a rain-soaked Manhattan street, a billionaire CEO collapsed into the arms of a stranger. What she didn't know was that 15 years ago, her rise to power had destroyed this man's entire world. Tonight, you'll witness an extraordinary story of hidden connections, buried guilt, and the kind of forgiveness that can heal even the deepest wounds. But before we begin this incredible journey, if stories of redemption and second chances touch your heart like they do mine, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories that remind us of the beauty in human connection. Now let's discover what happens when the past and present collide in the most unexpected way. I destroyed your life 15 years ago. CEO's shocking confession to single dad. Who saved her? The autumn rain fell like tears across Manhattan's gleaming streets, each droplet catching the amber glow of streetlights in luxury storefronts. Outside the Metropolitan Museum's annual charity gala, designer gowns and tailored suits hurried beneath umbrellas, their laughter and conversation creating a warm bubble of privilege against the cold night. But in the shadows beyond the red carpet, a different story was unfolding. Victoria Sterling stood motionless against the museum's limestone facade, her emerald evening gown now darkened with rain. The woman who commanded boardrooms and shaped skylines felt her world spinning out of control. Her chest tightened with each breath, her vision blurring as the weight of her empire pressed down like a physical force. The panic attack hit without warning, as they always did lately. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the wet sidewalk, her carefully constructed facade crumbling along with her body. Ma'am, are you okay?" The voice was gentle but urgent, cutting through the haze of her distress. Strong hands steadied her shoulders as she fought to breathe, fought to remember who she was supposed to be. David Chen had been walking home from his second job when he saw her fall. The sight of someone in distress overrode every instinct that told him to keep walking to avoid the complications that came with getting involved in other people's problems. He knelt beside the collapsed woman, his worn work jacket darkening in the rain. "Just breathe," he said softly, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had guided others through difficult moments before. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it." Victoria's eyes focused on his face, weathered but kind, with lines that spoke of worry and responsibility rather than age. His hands were rough from honest work, so different from the manicured fingers of the men in her world. "I'm fine," she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't true. "I just need—" "You need to sit for a minute," David interrupted gently. He helped her to a nearby bench, shrugging out of his jacket to place it around her shoulders, despite the rain soaking through his thin shirt. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence. The sounds of the gala faded into background noise as Victoria's breathing slowly steadied. She found herself studying this stranger who had appeared in her moment of vulnerability, the way he waited patiently without demanding explanations, how he positioned himself to shield her from curious glances without making it obvious. "Better?" he asked finally. "Much, thank you." She started to remove his jacket, but he stopped her with a gentle gesture. "Keep it. You're still shaking." "I don't even know your name." "David. David Chen." "Victoria." She hesitated, then decided against adding her last name. Tonight she wanted to be just Victoria, not the CEO whose face graced magazine covers and business journals. "Can I call someone for you? A family member driver?" The question hit her unexpectedly hard. Family. Her parents had been dead for over a decade. Friends, the people at the gala would see her collapse as a sign of weakness, something to be exploited or gossiped about. Her driver would be professional and discreet, but the concern in David's eyes was something money couldn't buy. "No," she said quietly. "There's no one to call." David studied her face, recognizing something he knew all too well, the particular loneliness that came with carrying the weight of responsibility alone. "Well," he said, standing and offering his hand, "let me at least get you somewhere dry. There's a diner around the corner. Best coffee in the neighborhood, and they don't ask questions." Against every instinct her wealth and position had taught her, Victoria took his hand and let him help her up. The diner was everything her usual haunts were not, fluorescent lit with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of honest cooking. But it was warm and quiet, and the elderly waitress simply nodded when David requested a corner booth and 2 coffees without judgment about Victoria's disheveled appearance. "So," David said, wrapping his hands around his mug, Rough night, Victoria almost laughed at the understatement. You could say that. What about you? Do you make a habit of rescuing strangers? Only when they need it. His smile was self-deprecating. I was walking home from work. Second job, he added, as if that explained everything about his willingness to stop and help. Two jobs. Victoria found herself genuinely curious. In her world, people complained about being overworked while earning more in bonuses than most families saw in a lifetime. Day jobs construction, night jobs at a community center teaching basic computer skills to adults. Nothing glamorous, but it keeps food on the table and a roof over our heads. Our heads. My son and me, Marcus. He's 16. David's entire demeanor softened when he spoke about his son, and Victoria recognized the fierce protectiveness of a single parent doing everything possible to provide for their child. His mother, cancer, 3 years ago. The simple words carried a weight of grief that Victoria felt in her chest. I'm sorry. She was an amazing woman. Marcus has her eyes, her kindness. She'd have liked you, I think. How could you possibly know that? Because you stopped to talk to a stranger in a diner instead of calling a car to take you back to whatever fancy party you came from. David's eyes held no judgment, only gentle observation. That says something about who you really are. Victoria stared into her coffee, unsure how to respond. When was the last time someone had seen past her title and wealth to notice her character? When was the last time anyone had bothered to look? Tell me about Marcus, she said instead. David's face lit up. He's incredible. Top of his class, wants to study engineering. He's got this way of looking at problems, breaks them down into pieces, figures out how to build something better. He gets that from his mom. Sounds like he gets his determination from his father too. Maybe. I just want him to have choices I never had. Better opportunities. David paused, seeming to weigh his words. We've had some tough years. Lost our house when Elena got sick, had to start over. But Marcus never complained, never asked for things we couldn't afford. He's got this quiet strength that amazes me every day. Victoria found herself thinking about her own teenage years, private schools, summer houses, the assumption that every door would open simply because of her name. What kind of person would she have become if she'd learned David's lessons about resilience and sacrifice? What about you? David asked. What do you do when you're not collapsing in the rain? I run a company, real estate development. That sounds important. Sometimes I wonder. The honesty surprised her. Tonight I was at a charity gala surrounded by hundreds of people who know my name, my net worth, my business strategies. But when I needed help, I was completely alone until a stranger showed me kindness. David considered this. Maybe the problem isn't that you were alone, Shishon. Maybe it's that you've been surrounded by the wrong kind of people. They talked until the diner began preparing for the morning shift, their conversation flowing between light topics and profound observations. Victoria learned that David read voraciously, borrowing books from the library because he couldn't afford to buy them. David discovered that Victoria volunteered at animal shelters on weekends, the only time her schedule allowed for activities that weren't about profit margins and board meetings. When David finally walked her to the curb, where her driver waited, she texted him an hour earlier the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under the early morning light. Thank you, Victoria said, handing him back his jacket, for everything. Take care of yourself, Victoria, and maybe find some people who see you the way you really are. As her car pulled away, Victoria watched David's figure disappear into the morning crowd of people heading to work carrying lunchboxes and travel mugs, living lives of quiet dignity that her world rarely acknowledged. She didn't expect to see him again. In her experience, moments of authentic human connection were like shooting stars, beautiful, brief, and impossible to recreate. She was wrong. 3 weeks later, Victoria found herself in an elementary school gymnasium in Queens, attending a fundraising dinner for the public school system. It wasn't her usual charity. She typically focused on arts organizations and university endowments that offered better networking opportunities. But something had drawn her to this smaller, more personal cause. The gymnasium was decorated with student artwork and hand-lettered banners. Parents and teachers filled folding chairs around tables covered with plastic tablecloths and donated centerpieces. The energy was warm and genuine, so different from the polished perfection of her usual social events. Victoria. She turned at the familiar voice and found David standing behind her wearing a clean button-down shirt and slacks, his expression as surprised as her own. David, what are you doing here? Marcus goes to school here. He's actually receiving an award tonight, academic excellence. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. That's wonderful. You must be so proud. Every day, David gestured to an empty chair at his table. Would you like to sit with us? I promise the company's better than the catering. Victoria accepted, finding herself at a table with other parents who welcomed her warmly, despite her obviously expensive dress and jewelry. They spoke about their children's achievements, their concerns about school funding, their hopes for their kids' futures. No one asked about her business or her wealth. She was simply another adult who cared about education. When Marcus took the stage to accept his award, Victoria understood immediately why David glowed with such pride. The teenager was thoughtful and articulate, thanking his teachers and dedicating his achievement to his mother's memory and his father's sacrifice. He's remarkable, Victoria whispered to David. He is, and he did it despite everything we've been through. After the ceremony, Marcus joined their table, polite and curious about his father's new acquaintance. Victoria found herself genuinely interested in his thoughts about engineering, his plans for college, his perspective on growing up in Queens. Dad says you work in real estate, Marcus said during dessert. That must be interesting. It has its moments. What kind of engineering interests you most? Sustainable design. I want to figure out how to build affordable housing that doesn't hurt the environment. Dad and I have talked about how many families need decent places to live, but everything's so expensive. Victoria felt something twist in her chest. Her company built luxury developments, high-end properties that drove up neighborhood costs and often displaced long-term residents. When was the last time she'd considered the social impact of her business decisions? That's a noble goal, she said carefully. Marcus has been researching it for years, David added. He's got notebooks full of ideas about sustainable materials, energy-efficient designs, ways to bring down construction costs without sacrificing quality. As the evening wound down, Victoria walked with David and Marcus to the school's exit. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter, and she found herself reluctant to return to her empty penthouse. Would you like to get coffee sometime? The invitation slipped out before she could second-guess herself. David smiled. I'd like that. They exchanged phone numbers, and as Victoria's driver arrived, she realized she was looking forward to their next conversation in a way she hadn't anticipated anything in years. Over the following weeks, their friendship developed gradually and naturally. They met for coffee on Sunday mornings when David's construction sites were quiet and Victoria could escape her office. They talked about books, about Marcus's college applications, about the small moments that made life meaningful. David never asked about her wealth, though she suspected he was beginning to understand the scale of it. Victoria never probed about the tough years he'd mentioned, sensing that some stories needed to emerge naturally. What she didn't know was that David's tough years had a name, a specific cause that would soon change everything between them. And what David didn't know was that the woman who was becoming so important to him held the key to understanding exactly how his life had been destroyed 15 years earlier. The revelation would come soon enough, triggered by a casual conversation and a name that would make David's blood run cold and Victoria's world crumble all over again. But for now, in these precious weeks of discovery and growing trust, they were simply two people who had found something rare, genuine connection in a world that often felt impossibly lonely. Neither of them imagined that their past was about to collide with their present in the most devastating way possible. The manila folder sat on David's kitchen table like an unexploded bomb. Inside were the documents he'd carried from apartment to apartment for 15 years. Legal papers, newspaper clippings, and photographs that told the story of how his family's life had been destroyed. Marcus was at the library working on college applications, giving David rare solitude in their small Queens apartment. The walls were thin, but the space was theirs, filled with secondhand furniture and memories they'd built together after losing everything. David rarely looked at these papers anymore. The lawsuit was long over, the statute of limitations expired, the injustice accepted as just another way the world worked. But lately, something had been nagging at him, a half-remembered detail that wouldn't let go. It had started 3 days earlier during coffee with Victoria. She'd mentioned her company almost casually, the way people do when they assume their work is too boring to discuss. Sterling Development, she had said. We focus on mixed-use projects, mainly commercial and residential integration. The name had hit David like a physical blow, but he'd managed to keep his expression neutral, making some non-committal comment about the challenges of urban planning. Victoria had moved on to asking about Marcus's SAT scores, and David had followed her lead, storing the shock for later examination. Now in the harsh fluorescent light of his kitchen, David opened the folder and spread its contents across the scratched table surface. The newspaper headlines jumped out at him: Queens Community Center demolished for luxury development, and families displaced as Sterling Development begins construction. Sterling Development, Victoria's company. David's hand shook as he picked up the official letter that had changed everything. It was addressed to Elena Chen, dated 15 years ago and signed by the project manager for Sterling Development's Queens Expansion Initiative. Dear Mrs. Chen, it began. We regret to inform you that your property has been selected for acquisition under the city's eminent domain statute. Sterling Development Corporation, in partnership with the City of New York, will be constructing a mixed-use facility that will serve the greater good of the community. The letter was polite, legal, and devastating. It had given them 30 days to vacate the small house where Elena ran her daycare business, the home where Marcus had taken his first steps, where David had planned to grow old with his wife. The compensation offered was a fraction of the property's true value, not enough to buy anything comparable in the area. They'd fought it, hired a lawyer they couldn't afford, had attended community meetings where other families shared similar stories of displacement and inadequate compensation. It hadn't mattered. Sterling Development had city-backing political connections and resources the small community couldn't match. The luxury development had been built on schedule, featuring high-end condominiums that sold for more than David now made in 5 years. The stress of the legal battle and forced relocation had worsened Elena's underlying health conditions. The cancer diagnosis had come 2 years later, but David had always wondered if the upheaval and anxiety had somehow contributed to her illness. He stared at Victoria's company logo on the letterhead, remembering the woman who had laughed at Marcus's engineering dreams just days earlier, who had listened with genuine interest as David talked about his hopes for his son's future. The same woman whose company had destroyed those hopes before they had even properly formed. David's phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Looking forward to Sunday coffee. Marcus's Columbia interview went well. He stared at the message for a long time before turning off his phone without responding. The next morning, David couldn't concentrate on work. His construction crew noticed his distraction as he made mistakes he had never made before, measuring twice but somehow cutting wrong anyway. You okay, boss? Asked Tommy, his longtime foreman. You seem like your mind's somewhere else. Just family stuff, David replied, which was both true and completely inadequate. During his lunch break, David found himself walking through the neighborhood where his old house had stood. The luxury development rose before him like a monument to his family's displacement. The condominiums were beautiful, all glass and steel, and carefully landscaped gardens. Young professionals hurried in and out of the lobby carrying yoga mats and organic grocery bags, living lives of comfortable privilege. David tried to imagine his old house's footprint beneath the foundation, tried to remember exactly where Elena's daycare room had been, where Marcus had played in the backyard that no longer existed. A security guard approached him as he lingered too long on the sidewalk. Can I help you, sir? I used to live here, David said quietly. Oh. The guard's expression softened slightly. Before the development. Yeah, before. And they stood together in awkward silence until David walked away carrying the weight of 15 years' worth of what-ifs and might-have-beens. That evening, Marcus found his father sitting at the kitchen table staring at the spread of documents. Dad, what's all this? David looked up at his son, tall now, with Elena's eyes and an expression of growing concern that made him look older than 16. History, David said finally. Our history. Marcus sat down across from him, studying the papers with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. After several minutes, he looked up. This is about the house. You remember. Pieces. I remember Mom crying. I remember you being angry all the time. I remember living with Grandma and Grandpa for a while. David nodded. His parents had taken them in after the displacement, cramming their small family into an already crowded apartment until David could find work and a new place to live. I never understood why we had to leave, Marcus continued. You always just said it was complicated. It was complicated and it wasn't. David picked up the Sterling Development letter. A company wanted to build something profitable. We were in the way. Marcus read the letter carefully, his engineering mind processing the legal language and implications. This is the compensation they offered for the house and mom's business. That's what they deemed fair market value. But it's not even close to what the property was actually worth. I've been researching real estate values for my economics project. This amount wouldn't have bought you anything comparable. David felt a familiar surge of pride at his son's analytical thinking, tinged with sadness, that a 16-year-old had to understand such harsh realities about fairness and power. No, it wouldn't have. We tried to fight it, but the system was rigged against people like us. Marcus was quiet for several minutes reading through more of the documents. Finally, he looked up with an expression David recognized, the same determined focus Elena had worn when she decided to fight their displacement. Sterling Development, Marcus said. Isn't that Victoria's company? Yes. The simple acknowledgement hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Does she know, Marcus asked, about what her company did to us? I don't think so. She would have been pretty young 15 years ago, probably not involved in day-to-day operations. But it's still her company. Yes, it's still her company. Marcus gathered the papers into a neat stack, his movements precise and thoughtful. What are you going to do? It was the question David had been avoiding all day. What do you do when you discover that someone you've come to care about represents everything that had gone wrong in your life? I don't know, he admitted. Do you think she's a bad person? David considered this. Victoria had shown genuine kindness to Marcus, real interest in his dreams and aspirations. She'd helped David through his panic that night without expecting anything in return. Her concern for others seemed authentic, not performed. No, he said finally. I don't think she's a bad person. Then maybe she deserves to know the truth. David looked at his son with renewed amazement. At 16, Marcus had already learned lessons about justice and forgiveness that David was still struggling to understand. Maybe she does, David agreed. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Sterling was having her own reckoning with the past. It had started with a phone call from her head of legal affairs asking about old files that needed to be digitized for the company's new document management system. We're focusing on the 2005-2015 period first, Jessica explained. Some of the older Queens projects from that era. There are community relations issues we should probably review before the files go to storage. Community relations issues. Victoria's stomach clenched at the euphemism. She'd inherited Sterling Development from her father along with his aggressive expansion philosophy and his belief that progress sometimes required difficult decisions. She'd tried to reform the company's practices over the past 5 years, implementing community input processes and fair compensation standards. But she'd never looked closely at what her predecessors had done in her name before she took control. Send me everything from the Queens projects, Victoria instructed. I want to review them personally. The files arrived the next morning, 3 boxes of documents that chronicled her company's systematic displacement of working-class families in the name of urban renewal. As Victoria read through the legal correspondence and community impact statements, she felt increasingly sick. The pattern was clear. Identify properties in neighborhoods poised for gentrification use, political connections to initiate eminent domain proceedings, offer minimal compensation, and build luxury developments that served wealthy buyers rather than community needs. Her father had been thorough and legally careful, but morally devastating. Victoria found herself focusing on one case in particular, a family-run daycare business that had served the community for over a decade. The owner, Elena Chen, had written multiple letters pleading for fair compensation, explaining that the business supported not just her family but provided affordable childcare for working parents in the neighborhood. The letters were professional but increasingly desperate, documenting failed negotiations and inadequate offers. The final letter, dated 6 months after the initial displacement notice, was heartbreaking. My husband David works construction, and I run this daycare because we believe in building strong communities where families can thrive. Your company is forcing us to abandon everything we've worked for, scattering the families we serve and destroying the relationships that make neighborhoods into homes. I hope someday you'll understand the human cost of your profits. Victoria stared at the signature, Elena Chen. Chen. David's last name was Chen. With growing dread, Victoria pulled up the property records and found the address. She cross-referenced it with the luxury development that had been built on the site, confirming what she already knew in her heart. David Chen's house, David's wife's business. David's family had been destroyed by her company 15 years ago, and she'd been having coffee with him for weeks without knowing it. Victoria's hands shook as she read Elena Chen's final letter again. The woman who had written these words was dead now, David had told her. Cancer 3 years after the displacement. Had the stress contributed to her illness? Had the financial strain delayed treatment? The questions Victoria didn't want to answer kept multiplying. She spent the rest of the day reading through David's family's and learning about their unsuccessful legal challenge, their temporary displacement to David's parents' apartment, their struggle to rebuild their lives after losing everything. The file noted that Elena Chen had died of cancer in 2018, 3 years after the displacement. David Chen was listed as a single father working multiple jobs to support his son Marcus, a high-achieving student at the local public school. Marcus, the remarkable teenager who wanted to design affordable housing, who dedicated his academic award to his mother's memory and his father's sacrifice. Victoria understood now why David's eyes held such deep awareness of life's fragility, why he worked 2 jobs without complaint, why he was so proud of his son's resilience. Her company had taught him those lessons. As evening approached, Victoria's phone buzzed with a reminder about her Sunday coffee date with David. The casual normalcy of the notification felt obscene given what she now knew. She had to tell him. But how do you confess to someone that you've unknowingly benefited from their suffering? How do you apologize for a crime you inherited but didn't commit? Victoria thought about David's gentle kindness, the way he'd helped her during her breakdown without asking for anything in return. She remembered Marcus's dreams of building better communities, his determination to create affordable housing that wouldn't displace families like his own. The irony was devastating. The people her company had harmed were better human beings than most of her business associates. They'd survived her father's greed and emerged with their integrity intact while she'd spent years unconsciously profiting from their pain. Victoria canceled her Sunday plans and spent the weekend researching everything she could about Sterling Development's Queens projects. The pattern of displacement was extensive, affecting dozens of families over a 5-year period. Her company had been systematic in its targeting of vulnerable communities, strategic in its use of legal loopholes, and indifferent to the human cost of its ambitions. By Monday morning, Victoria had made a decision that would change everything. She called Jessica into her office first thing and laid out her findings. I want you to research every family displaced by our Queens projects between 2005 and 2015, Victoria instructed. Names, current addresses, if possible documentation of inadequate compensation. I want to know exactly how many people we harmed and how we can make it right. Jessica's expression was carefully neutral. That's going to be extensive research and potentially expensive if you're considering retroactive compensation. I don't care about the cost. I care about the damage we did. Victoria, you weren't even running the company then. These decisions were made by your father and his team. You can't be held responsible for. I've been profiting from those decisions for 5 years, Victoria interrupted. That makes me responsible now. Jessica gathered the files, her expression troubled. This could open us up to legal challenges from other displaced families. Once word gets out that we're offering settlements, good, they deserve settlements. They deserved them 15 years ago. After Jessica left, Victoria sat alone in her office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline her wealth had helped build. Somewhere in Queens, David was probably starting his construction shift, creating homes for other people, while still dealing with the loss of his own. She had to find a way to make things right. But first, she had to find the courage to tell him the truth. That evening, Victoria finally responded to David's unanswered messages. Can we meet tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you. David's response came quickly. I think we need to talk too. Neither of them slept well that night, both knowing that their next conversation would either destroy their friendship or transform it into something deeper and more complicated than either had imagined possible. The truth was waiting for them, patient and immutable as gravity. The diner where they'd first talked seemed different now, charged with the weight of revelations that neither David nor Victoria was ready to share. They sat across from each other in the same corner booth, but the comfortable ease of their previous conversations had been replaced by careful tension. Victoria had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but looking at David's familiar face weathered by honest work and responsibility, every prepared speech crumbled. You said you needed to tell me something. David said finally, his voice gentle but strained. Victoria pulled out the manila folder she'd brought, her hands trembling slightly. 15 years ago, my company Sterling Development initiated several urban renewal projects in Queens. David's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. I see. I've been reviewing the files from that period, trying to understand, trying to face what we did. Victoria opened the folder and removed Elena Chen's letters. I found correspondence from a woman named Elena Chen. She ran a daycare business. Her family was displaced to make room for one of our developments. David stared at the letters, his wife's handwriting, her careful words pleading for fairness that never came. That was my wife, he said quietly. I know. Victoria's voice broke slightly. David, I am so sorry. I didn't know I wasn't running the company then, but that doesn't matter. We destroyed your family's life, and I've been profiting from that destruction ever since. David picked up one of Elena's letters, reading words he'd watched her write in their kitchen 15 years ago, when they still believed in the possibility of justice. She was so hopeful at first, he said. Elena always believed that if you just explained the situation clearly enough, people would do the right thing. She sounds like she was a wonderful person. She was. She saw the best in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. David looked up at Victoria. Even when your company was taking everything from us, she never became bitter. She said holding on to anger would poison Marcus's childhood. Victoria felt tears threatening, but forced herself to continue. I've had our legal team research compensation options. I know it can never undo what happened, but I want to make things right financially, whatever it takes. David was quiet for a long moment, still holding Elena's letter. Is that why you befriended us, out of guilt? No. Victoria's response was immediate and fierce. I didn't know who you were when we met. I befriended you because you showed me kindness when I needed it most, because you and Marcus reminded me what authentic human connection looks like. But now that you know, Victoria met his eyes directly. Now that I know, I care about you even more, and I'm horrified by what my family's business did to yours. David carefully returned Elena's letter to the folder. I need you to know something too. I've known who you were for the past week. Victoria felt her stomach drop. What? I recognized your company name when you mentioned it. I've been carrying these documents for 15 years. David gestured to the folder. I know every detail of what Sterling Development did to my family. And you didn't say anything. I needed time to process it, to figure out what it meant. David leaned back in the booth, studying Victoria's face. Do you want to know what I concluded? Victoria nodded, afraid to speak. You're not your father. You're not responsible for decisions made before you had control, and David paused, choosing his words carefully. The person who helped me through a panic attack in the rain, who listens to Marcus talk about engineering like his dreams actually matter, that person isn't capable of the calculated cruelty your company showed back then. But I still benefited from it. I'm still the face of the company that Victoria. Now, David's voice was calm but firm. What are you planning to do about it? Victoria pulled out a second folder, this one thick with legal documents and financial projections. I'm establishing a fund for all the families displaced by our Queens projects. Full compensation based on current property values plus damages for business losses and relocation costs. For your family specifically, she slid a check across the table. This covers the difference between what we should have paid for your house and what we actually offered, plus lost income from Elena's daycare business, calculated with 15 years of interest. David stared at the check. The amount was more than he made in 3 years, enough to pay for Marcus's college education without loans enough to change everything about their financial situation. I can't accept this. David, I can't accept it, he repeated, pushing the check back across the table. Not like this. I don't understand. David was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with something difficult. Finally, he looked up at Victoria with an expression she couldn't read. If you really want to make amends, do it publicly. Acknowledge what your company did wrong. Accept responsibility. Make sure other families in similar situations get justice too. That would destroy my company. The legal liability alone, yes, it probably would. Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. You're asking me to sacrifice everything I've built. I'm asking you to do what Elena would have done if the situations were reversed. Choose what's right over what's profitable. The challenge hung between them like a bridge over an impossible chasm. Victoria understood what David was really asking, not just for money but for justice. Not just private restitution, but public accountability. If I do this, Victoria said slowly, I lose everything, my company, my wealth, probably my reputation. And if you don't, we go back to pretending this never happened. You take the money, I ease my conscience, and nothing really changes. David nodded. That's about right. Victoria thought about the other families Sterling development had displaced the pattern of legal but immoral behavior that had built her empire. She thought about Marcus's dreams of creating affordable housing, about Elena's letters that no one in power had bothered to read with empathy. I need time to think about this. Of course you do. They parted that evening with everything unresolved, both understanding that their next conversation would determine not just their relationship, but the kind of person Victoria would choose to be going forward. Over the next week, Victoria found herself unable to focus on anything else. She met with lawyers who confirmed David's assessment. Public acknowledgement of Sterling Development's past practices would open them to massive legal liability. The company would likely face bankruptcy within months. She also met with the families her research had identified, listening to story after story of displacement, inadequate compensation, and lives disrupted by her father's ambitions. Each conversation made the moral choice clearer and the financial consequences more devastating. Meanwhile, David struggled with his own ethical dilemma. Marcus had been accepted to Columbia with a partial scholarship, but they still needed significant additional funds for tuition and living expenses. The check Victoria had offered would solve that problem instantly. You should take the money, Dad, Marcus said one evening as they reviewed financial aid documents. It's not about accepting charity. It's about them finally paying what they owed us 15 years ago. It's more complicated than that. Is it you've worked 2 jobs for years to give me opportunities? This is an opportunity. A big one. Why, David looked at his son, brilliant, determined, on the verge of achieving everything they dreamed of together. What kind of example would I be setting if I accepted private compensation while other families got nothing? You'd be setting an example of taking care of your family. Mom would understand. It was a low blow delivered with teenage certainty about moral simplicities that David envied. But Marcus was wrong about one thing. Elena would have understood the complexity of the choice, even if she couldn't have made it any easier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Victoria was reviewing legal documents in her office when Jessica knocked on her door. There's something you need to see, Jessica said, holding a newspaper. It's about the Riverside Community Center. Victoria recognized the name, another of Sterling Development's Queens projects, a community center that had been demolished to make way for luxury condominiums. The newspaper article described a new initiative by a coalition of community groups and legal advocates challenging old eminent domain cases where compensation had been inadequate. The Riverside case was their test project, and they were seeking other families who had been similarly affected. David Chen is quoted in the article, Jessica said carefully. Victoria read the relevant section. Chen, whose family was displaced by Sterling Development in 2009, says he's not interested in personal compensation. This isn't about individual settlements, Chen stated. It's about changing a system that allows companies to profit from community destruction. Real accountability requires admitting mistakes publicly and changing how business gets done. Victoria stared at the quote, understanding finally what David had been trying to tell her. This wasn't about their personal relationship or even about money. It was about justice as a public good rather than a private transaction. That evening, Victoria called an emergency board meeting. I'm proposing that Sterling Development voluntarily disclose our past eminent domain practices and establish a public compensation fund for affected families, she announced to the stunned board members. The reaction was predictably harsh. Board members spoke of fiduciary responsibility, legal liability, and corporate suicide. Victoria listened patiently, then presented her own analysis. We can destroy the company through legal battles and public relations disasters when this all comes out anyway, she said. Or we can control the narrative by taking responsibility first and demonstrating that corporations can change. Victoria, this is your inheritance we're talking about. said Richard Hayes, her father's longtime business partner. Everything your family built. Everything my family built was constructed on other families' suffering. I don't want that inheritance. The vote was close, but Victoria's controlling interest carried the decision. Sterling Development would go public with their past practices within the month. The press conference was surreal, Victoria standing at a podium, formally apologizing for her company's actions and announcing the compensation fund. Reporters peppered her with questions about legal liability and financial impact, but Victoria kept her focus on the human cost of corporate greed. David watched the press conference from his apartment, Marcus beside him on their second-hand couch. She did it, Marcus said quietly. She actually did it. David felt something he hadn't expected. Not vindication or satisfaction, but profound sadness for what Victoria was losing in order to do what was right. The consequences were swift and severe. Sterling Development faced immediate lawsuits, canceled contracts, and investor flight. Within 6 months, the company was forced into bankruptcy proceedings. Victoria's personal wealth evaporated as she liquidated assets to fund the compensation program. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath. Media coverage of Victoria's decision sparked a broader conversation about corporate accountability and community development. Other companies facing similar legal challenges began reaching out, wanting to understand how to acknowledge past mistakes without destroying their businesses entirely. Victoria found herself consulting with the community organizations helping design development projects that strengthened rather than displaced existing neighborhoods. The work paid modestly but felt meaningful in ways her inherited wealth never had. A year after the press conference, Victoria and David met again at their old diner. Both looked older, marked by the weight of difficult choices and their consequences. "Do you regret it?" David asked. Victoria considered the question. She lived in a modest apartment, now drove a used car, and worried about money in ways she'd never experienced before. But she also slept through the night without medication for the first time in years. "No," she said finally. "I regret what my family did to yours. I regret not knowing about it sooner. But I don't regret trying to make it right. Even though it cost you everything. It cost me my father's legacy. It didn't cost me everything." Victoria met David's eyes. "I found out who I actually am when I don't have unlimited money to hide behind. That's worth something." David reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that would have been impossible when the weight of unacknowledged harm stood between them. "Marcus got a full scholarship to Columbia," he said. "Between that and the compensation fund, we'll be okay financially. I'm glad. He deserves every opportunity. He wants to intern with one of your community development projects this summer. Says he wants to learn how to build housing that helps people instead of hurting them." Victoria smiled, remembering the earnest teenager who dreamed of better communities. "I'd be honored to work with him." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the familiar rhythm of the diner's evening crowd, working people, grabbing quick dinners between shifts, families treating their children to milkshakes, elderly couples sharing coffee and newspapers. These were the people Victoria's father had seen as obstacles to profit. Now she understood they were the point of everything, the reason cities existed, the heart of what made communities worth preserving. "There's something else," David said eventually. He pulled out an envelope creased and worn. "I wrote this the night after our first conversation about Sterling Development. I never intended to give it to you, but I think you should read it now." Victoria opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 8 months earlier. "Victoria, by the time you read this, you'll know what your company did to my family. You'll probably think I stayed quiet because I was planning some kind of revenge or because I wanted to manipulate you into feeling guilty. The truth is simpler and more complicated. I stayed quiet because you reminded me of who Elena was before your company broke her spirit, someone who believed in the possibility of goodness even when the world seemed determined to disappoint her. I stayed quiet because your friendship with Marcus gave him something I couldn't, an adult who saw his potential without being blinded by worry about his future. I stayed quiet because in all our conversations, you never once treated me like someone to be pitied or dismissed. I stayed quiet because forgiveness isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something you choose to give when holding on to anger becomes more poisonous than letting it go. Elena taught me that. She forgave your company long before she died, not because they deserved it, but because she refused to let their cruelty poison our family's love. I forgave you before you even knew there was anything to forgive. Not because you're innocent, no one who benefits from injustice is truly innocent, but because forgiveness is how we break cycles of harm instead of perpetuating them. Whatever you decide to do with this knowledge, know that Marcus and I will be okay. We've survived worse than finding out our friend's company once hurt us. We've survived losing Elena. We can survive anything. But I hope you'll choose to be the person I think you really are, not the person your inheritance tried to make you. David. Victoria read the letter twice, tears blurring her vision the second time. You forgave me before I even confessed. I forgave Sterling Development. It took me longer to understand that you weren't really Sterling Development. But I was. I am. I'm still responsible. You're responsible for what you do going forward. You're not responsible for carrying your father's sins forever. They talked until the diner began closing their conversation, ranging from Marcus's college plans to Victoria's new work with community or organizations. When they finally parted ways, they did so with the understanding that their friendship had survived its greatest test. 6 months later, Victoria stood in a small Queens park that had been built on the site of another Sterling development project. She was there for the dedication ceremony, watching as David and Marcus unveiled a plaque honoring the families who had been displaced to make the park possible. The memorial listed 37 family names, including Elena Chen's. Below the names was a simple inscription: communities are built on connection, not displacement. May we remember the cost of progress and choose justice over profit. Plus, Marcus, now a college freshman studying sustainable engineering, spoke briefly about his mother's belief in building communities rather than just buildings. His voice was steady and mature, carrying Elena's faith in humanity's capacity for positive change. After the ceremony, Victoria found herself standing beside the memorial with David and Marcus. Autumn leaves drifted around them, golden and beautiful against the darkening sky. She would have liked this, David said, touching Elena's name on the plaque. She would have liked you, Marcus added, looking at Victoria. Mom always believed people could learn to do better if someone just showed them how. Victoria thought about Elena Chen, a woman she'd never met but whose letters had taught her more about courage than any business school or corporate mentor. Elena had faced displacement and injustice with dignity, had raised a remarkable son, despite crushing challenges, had chosen forgiveness over bitterness, even as her world crumbled. I hope I'm learning, Victoria said finally. As they walked out of the park together, Victoria realized that she'd found something she'd never known she was missing. Not just forgiveness or friendship, but purpose, the chance to spend her life building up rather than tearing down, creating communities instead of destroying them. The path hadn't been easy. Victoria's choice to prioritize justice over profit had cost her wealth, social status, and the easy certainty that money could solve any problem. But it had given her something more valuable, the knowledge that she could choose who to become, regardless of who she'd been before. Behind them, Elena Chen's name glowed softly in the lamplight, a reminder that some legacies are built on love rather than profit, and that the most important inheritance anyone can leave is the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything. The city lights twinkled around them as they walked toward their separate homes, three people bound together by loss, forgiveness, and the shared understanding that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to choose it. This incredible story reminds us that our past doesn't have to define our future, but our choices in the present determine the legacy we leave behind. Victoria Sterling lost everything she thought mattered, but gained something infinitely more valuable: the chance to rebuild her life on a foundation of justice rather than inherited wealth. If this story of second chances and the courage to do what's right touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and remind us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about choosing to build a better future. What would you have done in Victoria's position? Would you have sacrificed everything for justice or found a way to make peace with an imperfect compromise? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of hope, healing, and the extraordinary connections that can emerge from life's most unexpected moments. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Until next time, remember that every ending is also a beginning, And sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives start when we have the courage to close the book on who we used to be.